Welcome, Jeffrey. We have Jeffrey Smith with us here today. He is an international best-selling author, award-winning filmmaker, and leading spokesperson on the health dangers of genetically modified organisms. His book, The Seeds of Deception, ignited a movement by exposing the industry and government lies about the GMO safety. Jeffrey has spoken in 45 countries, and he's the creator of Healing from GMOs and the Roundup Summit. And he's also the founding director of the Institute of Responsible Technology, which is pioneering a new global effort to protect the microbiome from genetically engineered microbes. Jeffrey, so excited to talk to you today. I know there is a lot of talk about how GMOs are affecting us and our sensitivity to gluten, potentially even celiac disease. So really excited to hear your expertise and your experience and what you can share with our NEMA audience. So I'd love to start with just kind of a quick overview of exactly like what GMOs are and how they've gotten so widespread in our food supply. If you can talk a little bit about that and share your knowledge.
Absolutely. And I agree that as you'll learn, GMOs and the Roundup sprayed on them, and we'll talk about that, we believe are in fact a major contributor to the gluten sensitivity in the United States and around the world. And I'm not alone, although I was probably the first to raise this issue in 2012. I was invited by Mary's Gun Crackers, which creates gluten-free and organic products, to a press conference with Mark Hyman and a chef in New York, and I contacted a gluten guru, Tom O'Brien, and I said, "Here's my thesis as to why GMOs and Roundup lead to gluten sensitivity." And I pointed it out, and he said, "You're absolutely right. It's completely consistent." And then it's been in films, it's been in published papers now, and so it's a big deal. And if people are not aware of the GMO and Roundup connection to gluten sensitivity, it's very important that they are, because it will impact not only the dietary choices, but the potential for healing and reversal. So what's a GMO? Genetically modified organisms. You take a genes from one species and you insert it into other species, or you get gene editing and you change the sequence, or you knock out genes. Basically, you're using laboratory creations to mess up the sequence of DNA because you have something in mind you want it to do. So if you want to spray fields of soybeans with Roundup, which creates the poison glyphosate that normally would kill the soybeans, you create bacterial genes, insert them into the soybean, so you can spray the field with Roundup. The field of crops don't die, but all the weeds or other plant matter, the biodiversity in the field gets killed. And now we have an easy way to weed, to do weeding in a farm for farmers. So we have Roundup Ready soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa, all genetically engineered not to die when sprayed with Roundup. We also have 3 of those that produce their own toxic insecticide called Bt toxin, which kills insects by poking holes in their gut. Now, there's 2 traits I just described: herbicide tolerance, so you can spray herbicides like Roundup, and pesticide or insecticide producing, so the crops are actually characterized as pesticides. Both of those traits, the Roundup sprayed on the crops and the insecticide produced in the crops, are related to gluten sensitivity. But so too is the simple process of genetically engineering any organism. You create massive collateral damage in the DNA, which can create new allergens and toxins and carcinogens, and that too we'll see is related to gluten sensitivity and allergies, etc. So that's the basic concept of GMOs, and in a moment we're going to marry them with why we feel so bad when we eat them.
Yeah, so that's great. I think that's really interesting. It's awful that they have these insecticides in it that cause gut permeability. So what does that do to us? If it's doing that to the insects, that's pretty crazy. So that's great. That leads into my next question. I wanted to see, what are some of the health issues that you're seeing when people are exposed to GMOs or eating GMOs on a regular basis? How does that manifest in the human body? Obviously it sounds like leaky gut is one of the things, but what are some other ways that you're seeing that expressed in people's health?
Well, I mean, I've been speaking about this for 26 years, and we have more than 35 different diseases and disorders. I'm going to share my screen in a minute, um, that are related to GMOs and Roundup. And I'll just show you, for example, where you're looking at a chart that shows this line across here is the amount of glyphosate sprayed on wheat. Now, wheat is not genetically engineered, but Roundup is used as a desiccant just before harvest to spray on the wheat to dry it down. It also forces the wheat to ripen very quickly. So it's used when there's short growing seasons in the north part of North America, so that they want to get it picked up before it gets frozen. So it's sprayed on wheat and oats and beans and all that. So the way to avoid it is avoid not only GMOs, but also those products that are not GMO that are sprayed. So eating organic is the way. So here we have the amount of celiac disease charted in correlation with the amount of glyphosate sprayed to wheat. Now, this is correlation. It doesn't prove causation. You need other data for that. And we have a lot of other data. But let's just take a look at some of the other diseases. And this is just a handful. This is just a handful. I'm just going to read it quickly. I'll read the disease, and you look at the slope of the line, which will either be glyphosate or the amount of GMO corn and soy being produced, or both. And I'll read the disease, and you'll see the correlation. So this is inflammatory bowel disease. This is deaths from intestinal infection. This is peritonitis, and this is again plotted against glyphosate on wheat. There's only two on this that are related to glyphosate on wheat. The rest are on soy and corn. This is death from kidney failure, and this is both the percentage of GMO corn and soy crops in the United States and the amount of glyphosate sprayed on it. And I'm going to go through these very quickly just to give you a sense. This is hepatitis C. This is glyphosate applied compared to autism prevalence. See, notice that correlation. It's 0.9972. One is a perfect correlation. It's pretty devastating.
Wow.
Diabetes, deaths from stroke, dementia, deaths from senile dementia, deaths from Alzheimer's, deaths from Parkinson's, deaths from obesity, deaths from hypertension, anemia, insomnia, deaths from lipoprotein metabolism disorder, anxiety, schizophrenia, ADHD, bile duct cancer incidents, liver and bile duct cancer, kidney and renal pelvic cancer, urinary and bladder cancer, thyroid cancer, deaths from acute myeloid leukemia. Now, I also asked 3,256 people on a survey what they got better from when they switched to a non-GMO and largely organic diet. And you can see many of these 28 different conditions are also represented in the charts we just saw. So this is self-reporting. The other is correlation. Again, we need more data to show causation, but we're about to in the case of gluten sensitivity. You see digestive problems at a whopping 82%, and fatigue, overweight, obesity, brain fog, anxiety, depression, food allergies and sensitivities, and we're still above 50%. You can find, I'm not going to read this whole list. I'm just going to go down to gluten sensitivity. 42.2% of the more than 3,000 respondents said they got better from gluten sensitivity when they switched to a non-GMO and largely organic diet. Now, of those, about 500 people out of the 1,375 reporting improvements in gluten showed a significant improvement. Then about 300 were nearly gone and about 250 complete recovery, meaning 76% of all the respondents were either significant, nearly gone, or complete recovery. These were not small changes. Now, in that same survey, some people were answering not on behalf of themselves, but on behalf of their patients. So we had 31 practitioners also. The vast majority of these 31 were significant improvement, nearly gone, or complete recovery. So we've heard from, this is one example, Emily Lidner, based on my clinical experience, when I remove genetically modified foods as part of a treatment for gluten sensitivity, recovery is faster and more complete. And so we created back in 2013 a brochure. This image is from the brochure, and I'm going to be sharing some information about gluten in terms of why, in fact, we see what are the modes of action, which we can get to in a minute,
Hmm.
of why. I mean, we can do modes of action of any of those things. Like insomnia, for example, is closely correlated with the increased use of Roundup on foods. And we know why that could be.
Hmm.
Because glyphosate, which is part of Roundup, disables the shikimate pathway in gut bacteria, which prevents the production of L-tryptophan, which is the precursor to serotonin, which is the precursor to melatonin, which helps us get to sleep.
Hmm.
So you can see exactly, you can see why cancer is linked, because the World Health Organization describes glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. We could understand why it could be ADHD, autism. We understand plausible modes of action. We also see animal feeding studies where you isolate an animal in a controlled situation, you feed them GMOs or Roundup, and they get the diseases we're talking about or their precursors. And then you have reports from clinicians that see the changes in their patient starting before GMOs were introduced, then the GMOs introduced, huge population, then they intervene and take people off of the diet and they get better. So we have all this converging lines of evidence. And basically, at this point, I'm saying you don't have to believe it, just switch to organic and watch. And
Hmm.
we have found people getting better, as you just saw.
So that's a great, that really leads into my next one. That's some great points to touch on. So if consumers want to start eating healthier and try to cut out GMOs out of their diet, what are recommendations? Like what should they be looking for on labels? Is eating organic enough, or is there something else that we should be, striving for to be able to fully cut them out of our diet?
Great question. So you can eat non-GMO stuff and avoid a lot of Roundup. And you want to avoid the GMOs and you want to avoid the Roundup. There's also Bt toxin, which is that insecticide,
Mhm.
and you avoid that as well. But that's not going to be the end game. Those are all problems. We'll see why in just a moment when we go into the details.
Mhm.
But in order to avoid Roundup sprayed on oats and wheat, and I mean, if you go and get hummus, you're at a party and you dip with hummus with a corn chip. So the corn is genetically engineered, sprayed with Roundup. It produces Bt toxin. So you got three potential damages from the GMO itself, from the Roundup, and from the Bt toxin. Now you're dipping the hummus, which is created from chickpeas. Chickpeas are practically soaked in glyphosate, high levels of residues. So if you have a non-GMO chip and dip,
Mhm.
now the corn is non-GMO, but it may be sprayed with Roundup, and the chickpeas are very likely sprayed with Roundup. So now if you have an organic chip and dip, it's not allowed to contain GMOs or be sprayed with Roundup or these other toxic synthetic chemicals. So eating organic plus whatever gluten restrictions that people
Mhm.
need is pretty important because you avoid both the GMOs and the Roundup.
Mhm. Okay. And then,
I should add to that, Erica. At responsibletechnology.org, we have a little database of all the study, all the tests that have been done on glyphosate residues on food in
Mhm.
North America. So if you're wondering which foods contain high levels of glyphosate, you can't always eat organic, and you
Mhm.
want to know what to avoid when you can't,
Mhm.
well, I can tell you oats and wheat, and I can tell you beans, lentils, things like that, mung beans. But take a look at responsibletechnology.org and look at the glyphosate residue database
Okay.
and look at the foods you normally buy. And there'll be some like, whoa, can't eat non organic in this category, or I'll basically be drinking glyphosate with my meal.
Wow, that's wild. And then is there a concern with organic foods? Obviously when they're spraying the pesticides and things like that, they're spraying one field, but can get carried over to other fields and things like that. Is there any regulations with organic foods to not be near somewhere that has GMO crops that could blow over to it? Like, is there a concern that organic foods may still have GMOs and pesticides on them?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's the nature of nature. It's bountiful, it spreads, whether we like it or not. So there's going to be some residues on organic of glyphosate. There's going to be some contamination of GMOs. There's going to be some fraud somewhere. So we can worry about it.
Mhm.
and worrying is toxic, so I wouldn't add that toxic to your toxic soup.
Just do the best
Uh,
you can, right?
exactly. Do your best you can. So here's an interesting thing. Organic does not require testing for amounts of pesticides, and it doesn't require testing for GMO contamination either. There is a non-GMO verification program called the Non-GMO Project. They do require testing if the product contains at-risk ingredients, meaning species which have been genetically engineered and released. So if it contains soy or corn, etc., they'll require testing. And if you get something that says non-GMO project verified and organic, that's actually better than just organic,
Okay.
because that means it's not only organic, but if there's any at-risk ingredients, it's been tested for
Mm,
contamination and it meets their 0.9% action threshold. So having the two together is really the gold standard, but you can't always get that.
okay. Okay, good to know. And then, so say someone, has been eating non-organic or GMO foods their whole life, and then all of a sudden wants to make the switch to improve their health, for myself included, I have like the HLA gene, which really holds on to toxins. I recently just did a total tox test, and I've been eating organic since I went for a long time, at least 12 years now. And my glyphosate and some of my chemicals were so high. I was like, how is this possible? First of all, I think it might be old exposures that my body is still holding on to. But am I still getting exposed from foods that I'm eating that I think are safe or think are organic and aren't? So what can people do if they want to make that switch to eating, GMO free and glyphosate free? But what can they do to actually get whatever glyphosate is in their body out of their body as well? Do you
It's
have any
great.
recommendations?
It's a very important question.
Mm.
And for years, I was asked the question, what can I do besides changing my diet? And I'd always answer, it's above my pay grade. I'm not a psychiatrist, healing practitioner. However, I started speaking at medical conferences in 2006 and ended up motivating tens of thousands of practitioners to prescribe non-GMO diets and to talk about the Roundup and whatnot. And I started interviewing or hearing doctors saying they have protocols and people are getting better, and they have detox protocols to rebuild and repair. I remember talking to Dietrich Klinghardt. He had a whole glyphosate
Mm.
program, and I said, "Oh, I may not be qualified to answer the questions, but I'm overqualified to ask them." So I
Mhm.
created a thing called Healing from GMOs and Roundup,
Mhm.
which is at livehealthybewell.com. And I interviewed a bunch of scientists about their protocols, whether it was Dietrich Klinghardt or Zach Bush or Kieran Krishnan or Joe Mercola or Lee Cowden and a bunch of people. And everyone has a different approach.
Mhm.
And again, I'm not qualified to say, well, this is the best one. I'll just say, here's the buffet, eat what you want. But basically, what they were all saying is you got to be organic and avoid the input. And then there was the detoxification protocols. Since glyphosate is designed to grab onto minerals and make them unavailable, it's a chelator. It was originally patented to clean boilers and pipes by scraping off the minerals. You need to mineralize because it disrupts the immune system and the neurotransmitter system, and it
Mhm.
damages the mitochondria and the intercellular communication, and damages the gut bacteria because it's an antibiotic and it creates leaky gut. All of those things can be addressed. The good news is when you switch to organic, the body's own intelligence can kick in. The other good news is that glyphosate is water soluble, and most of it leaves the body within a couple of weeks
Mhm.
through the urine.
Mhm.
So if you get a hair test, that'll tell you more about your history, but
Mhm.
a urine test will tell you more about your current footprint in terms of glyphosate.
Mhm.
Some gets deposited in the tissues. We know that from radio labeled studies on animals. It gets right down into the bone marrow, which is probably why non Hodgkin's lymphoma is so tightly correlated as a cancer with the application of Roundup. And there's
Mhm.
125,000 plaintiffs that are hoping to get, some of which have already gotten payment from Bayer that bought Monsanto, some of
Mhm.
which have been left in the dark. But so some is in there, but if you just switch to organic within 2 weeks, not only will a lot of Roundup be out of your system, but other toxic chemicals as well.
Mhm. Great. And then are there certain countries that have better restrictions or better bans on GMOs and Roundup versus, I know the US kind of everything goes and we use it on a lot of things,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
what are some countries that have better restrictions? And do you see less of these diseases that have kind of ramped up in the US? Is there less of that incidence in those countries because of their food supply?
I've asked some of the scientists that put together these correlations, can they do a comparison with the EU that has more restrictions on GMOs? And they say, yeah, but there's still a lot of glyphosate. You can find glyphosate in the urine of city dwellers throughout Europe.
Mm,
It's used on their foods as a desiccant as well.
mhm,
It's sprayed all over. But Europe has better non-GMO parameters.
mhm,
Now, the new type of GMO 2.0, gene editing, including CRISPR, is by some estimates is more dangerous.
mhm,
It creates a lot of disruption in the DNA. The journal Nature called it chromosomal mayhem, and they're still refining it for use in human gene therapy. But the agricultural biotechnology industry is rushing their products out to market, even though it's creating chromosomal mayhem.
mhm.
And so they've unfortunately convinced many governments, United States, Canada, UK, Japan, India, Australia, and several in South America to deregulate gene editing. In other words, turn a blind eye. Either they've already deregulated or it's in the process. And this means you can introduce a gene edited food into the marketplace in many cases without even telling the government. And if
Wow.
you do tell the government, they require no oversight or testing. And so they're trying to get the European Union to fall along the same fraudulent lines using these things. If you go to responsibletechnology.org, you can see a 6-minute animated video about what actually happens in the genome when you use gene editing, and it's called 7 Reasons Why Gene Editing is Dangerous and Unpredictable, and it gives you more information than the regulators have because they still believe Monsanto.
Mhm.
So eating in the United States is, Russian roulette, probably more dangerous than eating in Russia.
And that's a great question that leads to my next question. So, obviously when we eat out, we have way less control of our foods. And as it is, it's already complicated when you have celiac disease or gluten intolerance to eat out. So sometimes you have to make compromises and be like, okay, well, I'll eat this because I won't get glutened. And it may not be 100% organic or non-GMO. What are things that when you go out to eat, you can, look out for or ask for to avoid GMOs in addition to avoiding gluten?
There are some enzymes that I'm aware of and companies that I'm aware of that you can take these pills that are tested to digest gluten within an hour,
Mhm,
and usually the digestion in the stomach is an hour and a half.
mhm,
And the receptor cells at the very beginning of the intestines, which create the beginning of the gluten response, are outside the stomach.
mhm,
And we're going to talk about this when we get to the modes of action. I got
mhm.
all sorts of science for the crunchy ones here.
Mhm,
Um, so there's that. But you got to know, I mean, when you go out to eat, there's certain hidden GMOs.
mhm,
Um, these the oils, the
mhm,
cooking oil, the salad dressing, soy sauce, sugar, but not all of those are necessarily as dangerous as others. The sugar is pretty purified, 99, 98% purified, and we don't know if there's glyphosate in the sugar, even
And that's
though
mostly beet sugar versus cane sugar, right? That's the
exactly
amount. Yeah.
55% or so will be beet sugar, and 100% of the sugar beets in the United States are genetically engineered to withstand spraying of Roundup. Not the beets you buy that you eat.
Mhm,
Beet sugar is only for making sugar.
hmm,
Um, but so on our website, there's more details like what you ask for when you go out to eat. But basically, you look for the hidden GMOs when you want to avoid that. And then you want to avoid, as I mentioned, the products that we know are sprayed with Roundup heavily. Oats is one of the biggest.
mhm,
So it used to be that when I wanted a non-GMO breakfast and I was speaking around the world, I would have oatmeal.
mhm,
Now I don't have oatmeal unless it's organic ever. I'll travel with my own organic packet
mhm.
of instant oatmeal. Maybe not as nutritious as the stuff you have to cook, but
Traveling.
when you're in a hotel and you're speaking the next day, you don't have the way to
Mhm,
cook it.
mhm,
So I recommend people travel with food so that when they're in an airport or in a place that's not, it's kind of a food desert, they'll have
mhm,
some options. So going organic whenever possible, non-GMO when you can't go organic, and get your list down as to what high residue foods
mhm,
look like. And then when you're ordering at a restaurant, get a sense of what you're not going to order corn on the cob because corn is genetically engineered, or things with soy, like tofu, unless it says non-GMO. Certain things are obvious.
Mhm.
And then the meats and the eggs and the dairy can be from animals fed GMOs.
Mhm.
And we know of people that react to that when it's non-GMO or GMO. They'll react to it if the animals are fed GMOs. There's
Mhm.
no real research on that, but we have seen even people going to the hospital with anaphylactic shock
Wow.
when their own chickens were fed GM feed without them knowing, and they had a meal, and both the mother and the daughter in this one case. So highly sensitive people
Mhm.
look out for that, but it's harder to get the meat that's fed non-GMO.
Mhm. And then how long does it usually take for people to start developing symptoms or issues from GMOs? Like, is this from years and years of eating it, or is it from occasionally eating it? Like, is it like how quickly does it start to do damage to your body? Does like one meal with GMOs cause issues, or is this more of a long-term process that's escalated over our lives?
That is a great question, Erica.
Mhm.
For years, people would come up to me and say, I can feel it when I eat a GMO.
Mhm.
And I think around this time was 2005. I'd already been speaking about it for since 1996. So I've
Mhm.
been speaking about it for 10 years, traveling to 25 countries. And I am a little embarrassed to admit that I didn't believe them. Because, like, I was expecting just some little change in the charts. I mean, we saw those big changes in the charts. I was expecting some little blip, some signal that you can say, aha, see, you have an increase in this. But I started teaching physicians about what I know and other healthcare practitioners, and they came back to me and said, my patients get better when they switch to non-GMO. And the getting better, like Emily Linder, who had 5,000 patients on a non-GMO situation, she said, something with the anxiety and depression, it's almost immediate. With the allergies and sensitivities, asthma, maybe 3 to 7 days. And then with the digestive disorders, could be 2 months. And then you have to rebuild it maybe over 2 years. That was her thing with her protocols. So it doesn't translate into general. We've seen it with animals where a very quick response in either direction. Feed them a GMO, they start to plunge. Take it out,
Mhm.
they start to recover. I
Mhm.
remember one guy was walking through his nursery of 300 pigs. Maybe it was 3,000 pigs, I think. Anyway, he just noticed that they were all acting like piglets. There was a nursery like they had 14 years ago, and he had blamed. He was having to deal with so much sickness among his piglets and
Mhm.
constantly injecting them for 14 years. And that was the 14 years he was feeding them GMOs. And we switched
Wow.
to non-GMO corn. They were all of a sudden active and energetic in 2 to 3 days.
Wow.
And it was like shocking. And another person fed his pigs non-GMO soy and didn't tell his farmhand. And his farmhand came up to him and said, you changed the feed. And the guy said, uh-oh, what happened? He said, no more diarrhea. two
Wow.
days 2 days. So there's veterinarians that deal with pets and big animals that show big changes very quickly. And in the film Secret Ingredients that I did with Amy Hart, there are physicians that describe, they take their patients and put them on an organic diet, they
Mhm.
get better, and then the patients cheat. And sometimes it's one meal, and sometimes it's a weekend, and sometimes it's a vacation, and then their joint problems and their autoimmune disease or whatever starts coming back. And it
Mhm.
actually turns out to be a positive because they go, okay, I get it, I know what it is. But it depends. So the real question is, it depends on
Mhm.
the level of sensitivity. Sometimes it's immediate, but I would like to say when you switch to organic, take notes, percentage of organic at the top of your daily spreadsheet, and then all of your symptoms, 1 to 10, plus your energy level.
Mhm.
Fatigue was the number 2 reported benefit of
Mhm.
overcoming of all the people that we surveyed, and also the 150 lectures where I did a group survey of the audience.
Mhm.
Fatigue and mood.
Mhm.
Remember the anxiety and depression. So
Mhm.
symptoms, energy level, mood, and percentage of organic at the top every day, and see what happens.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great way to. I always when people are struggling with their diet or trying to figure out what's causing it, doing like a food diary or journal is like the best way to kind of track what you've eaten.
Oh,
So
yeah.
it makes sense to do it with this too. Okay, well, I know you have some other slides that you want to share with us, and
Well, these aren't
on
slides. This is
on a
just,
deep dive into
yeah,
some
yeah. This is
science.
this is a science class now. Okay, for some of you, you're going to sort of like, oh, I guess there's science, and everything is not going to be remembered. But the fact that there's science that makes sense, because I'm going to explain what happens and why this is the case, you're going to forget the science, but you're going to go, oh, that made sense. And it's going to reinforce the desire to be organic and whatnot. For others, you're going to jump in and say, what's that? What's that? And you're going to have to listen to this twice and write it down and stuff. And I'm going to speak to both. So you don't have to be into science. I don't care if your eyes glaze over normally with science. We're going to make it easy. Okay?
All right.
All right. So when you eat proteins, they get broken down into itsy bitsy pieces. That's the technical term. And that gets absorbed in your intestines for nutrition. Now, if you don't break it down, that's a problem, because proteins that are big and lumbering and whatnot hanging around, they last longer in the intestines. One of the characteristics of allergens is that they're hard to break down and can cause an allergic reaction. Now, when gluten hits the stomach, first pepsin and then trypsin are breaking it down. And if it doesn't break it down completely, then it can create reactions when it hits the intestines. Now, trypsin can be blocked by something called trypsin inhibitor. Genetically engineered soy has as much as 7 times the amount of trypsin inhibitor. So now gluten comes in and it's big and robust and it's not broken down. In addition, glyphosate, part of Roundup, it suppresses the breakdown of proteins. It suppresses the breakdown specifically of the peptides of gluten that cause leaky gut. So there's a particular thing that causes leaky gut. It's called zonulin. Zonulin is created by these 2 peptides from gliadin, which comes from gluten. So if you don't break down gluten all the way, now you've got a cascade of things, and all of a sudden the zipper opens up and you've got leaky gut, which is a very important component of gluten sensitivity. And there is a gluten, an enzyme that breaks down the protein. It's called PPP4. It's even used in concentrated form by autistic kids. Glyphosate suppresses that. So now glyphosate suppresses general digestive enzymes. It suppresses the particular breakdown of the peptide that's going to create leaky gut. And the genetically engineered soy blocks the basic body's own ability to break down the protein. Now, in addition to creating leaky gut, when they remain intact, the protein becomes food for bacteria. And that creates this excess hydrogen sulfide gas, which is horrible. And then that creates damage, irritation to the side of the intestines, right? And then when that happens, and that's part of celiac and all, when that happens, the body produces less of something called CCK. When CCK is produced in less, then it reduces the digestive enzymes further produced by the pancreas as well as the bile in the liver. So that means that when you have these big lumbering proteins coming out, then it can mess up the walls of the intestines and create even less digestive enzymes, which then becomes a negative cycle. The more big proteins you have that are undigested, the less enzymes you have, the more proteins, the less enzymes, and that's a cycle. So that's just
Or,
the breaking.
you're allergic to everything.
So then that's one. So the breakdown of foods, and you don't want to eat the GMOs or the Roundup. 2, damage to the walls of the intestines. We already talked about part of that, but the microvilli, there's little fingers that come out from the walls of the intestines. But if you have celiac disease and it's advanced, those have been damaged or destroyed.
Yep.
Now, it turns out that glyphosate damages directly the microvilli, but so does the Bt toxin. The Bt toxin produced in corn and in South America, also in some soy, can break up little little walls and knock them off and shorten them, etc. And this can cause low nutrient absorption, and the low nutrient absorption interferes potentially with the body's ability to suppress the immune system that attacks the proteins like gluten. So it's also a negative cycle. Okay, so now we have two.
Mm-hmm.
We have not breaking down the proteins, and a lot of reasons why, very specific and very mechanical, and damage to the walls of the intestines, including the microvilli. Now, we talked about leaky gut. You can put glyphosate on a petri dish with human intestinal cells, and they go like this, just immediately, right? Creating intercellular gaps between the cells. When you put high concentrations of Bt toxin in the same petri dish, not with the glyphosate, it'll create holes in those cells, the same holes that kill insects. That's intercellular leaky gut. Leaky gut is certainly linked with everything, actually. If you look to Alessio Fasano from Harvard, he wrote an article saying leaky gut is the beginning of all diseases. And certainly gluten sensitivity and allergies and autoimmune disease, but also cancer, and heart disease, and so many others, and mental disorders. Okay, so that's the leaky gut. Now, leaky gut is also exacerbated when you don't have proper gut bacteria. Now, the gut bacteria is damaged because glyphosate is an antibiotic. So when you look at the impact of feeding Roundup to a human microbiome, as my friend Kiran Krishnan did, that could explain. I went through each of the 28 different conditions that we showed earlier, from digestive disorders at the top to Parkinson's at the bottom. I said, let's go through each of these. You tell me, what happened in the human microbiome when you applied Roundup. Can you tell me if there's plausible causative pathways linking about what you found to these diseases? And every single one of them had it, including gluten sensitivity.
Wow.
And one of the reasons is that when you disrupt the microbiome, you create leaky gut. But there's all these other aspects of gut bacteria dysfunction that create other models. So now we have microbiome disruption. And then the final one is activation of the immune system. So we have a certain oral load. We have a certain amount of capacity in our systems to create an immune response. And if we start, like if you're allergic to cats and you just start an immune system, now you might be allergic to other things because your body's already reacting, because you've already hit your tolerance level. So what happens with GMOs and Roundup and Bt toxin, all three, is that they stimulate immune activity so that you start to become reactive. So glyphosate promotes inflammation. It damages the microbiome in a way that could also cause their dysfunctional mucosal layer that can attack the gluten or the kinds of food proteins. All of a sudden, it sends the immune system out because the microbes are not working and the immune system is activated from the glyphosate. Bt toxin, they fed it to mice. The mice not only reacted to the Bt toxin, but to formerly harmless foods, overcoming their tolerance. The GMOs, remember we talked about the massive collateral damage that can occur? There's certain GMOs that produce allergens that were never there before. So the whole system is promoting immune responses. So just to name them all, 5 of them, we have not breaking down proteins, damage to the microvilli, leaky gut, microbiome, and immune system activation. And those were the things that I thought of actually in 2012 and brought it back to the beginning to tie that together, brought it to Tom O'Brien, shared it at the press conference with Mark Hyman and others, and then wrote a report with the help of Stephanie Seneff and Tom O'Brien and Tom Moter and Sayerji, and then Stephanie and Samuel Anthony Samsel wrote their peer-reviewed published paper, and then then David Perlmutter is now in our film talking about it, and so is it's like now we understand
Mhm.
models that make sense. And all these people they're my teachers, they're my mentors. It's like what I do is I translate science into English. I'm not a scientist, but I collect it and organize it and get a chance to share it with everyone. So thank you for this opportunity.
Awesome. Yeah, this is great. This is so informative. I think it's going to be really helpful for people. It's easy to blame everything on just being gluten or just wheat, but there could be something a little bit deeper going on, especially with like gut health and things like that. So just something for people to be aware of and conscious. And so if they want to find out more information about you, what's the best place to find you? What's your website? And
Great.
you've got your book and stuff too. So let everyone know how they can get more information.
Well, I'm just setting up now because I send people to a lot of different websites.
Mhm.
I'm just setting up now one, jeffreysmith.org.
Okay.
And that will get you to the responsibletechnology.org, the glyphosate index, the animal findings if you have pets. It'll
Mhm.
get you to the healing from GMOs and Roundup. It'll get you to the Secret Ingredients movie, which has examples of people that are no longer sensitive when they switch to organic. So that's a world that I created it because of this question, because I
Mhm.
was normally get people getting their pens out and writing all these different URLs. So in a few days, we're going to have jeffreysmith.org opening up the whole world to
Great.
all of these things, and then people can figure out how to eat better and then dive into the science. And we also have glutenandgmos.com for those that are really interested for old stuff that we posted
Mhm.
years ago. People want to follow the history of it because they're, the kind of nerds like me.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, thank you so, so much. I really appreciate all your information and taking time to do this interview today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.